This is TLV1.
And welcome to the first in all of human history, very special joint, united, collective, coadjuvant, crossover edition of TLV1's Tel Aviv Review, hosted, of course, by Gilad Halpern, and TLV1's The Promise podcast, hosted by me, Noah Ephron. Longtime listeners of either of these very long-running shows will no doubt remember the general shock experienced by readers of Mark Twain when his beloved character Tom Sawyer appeared unannounced in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. People rubbed their eyes in amazement and thought, my God, Tom and Huck in the same literary universe. That all happened some time ago. Tom Sawyer was published in 1876 and Huck Finn in 1884, which is about the time that our two podcasts started. And I know that all of you are thinking, my God, could Gilad Halpern and Noah Ephron really be in the same podcastological universe? And today we are. This blessed union was, in truth, Gilad's idea, and the precipitating event was the publication recently of an open letter entitled Israel on the Edge of an Abyss. The letter begins like this, quote, "We, historians of the Jewish people and of the state of Israel, accuse the sixth government of Benjamin Netanyahu of endangering the very existence of the state of Israel and the Israeli nation," end quote. This j'accuse has over 160 signatories, including a great many of today's most renowned and brilliant historians of the Jewish people and of the state of Israel. About 120 of whom live and work in Israel, and 40 to 50 of whom live and work abroad, including at some of the most storied and illustrious and ivied universities in the world. Among them are historians of stunning insight and profundity, and many of them are personal heroes of mine. The 2.5-page letter, we'll link to it in our show notes, gets underway by saying that Israel was in the past a very different place than it is now becoming, especially now owing to the proposed judicial reform that was the catalyst for the letter, as for so many other protests over the past month and a half. Quote, "Jews who came to Israel in the first years of the state suffered, but in their contacts with the government, they acted without fear of persecution. In our own day, government ministers who accuse the public of attacking their own government and threaten citizens who go to demonstrations endanger this fundamental aspect of the state," end quote. The letter continues that, quote, "The current reform also poses a threat to the Israeli economy. To enable economic prosperity, investors need certainty and trust. The 1959 civil service law, which limited political appointments to government offices and established an independent, objective, and professional administration, protects society from corruption as well as favoritism. Minister Levine's proposal to politicize the committee that appoints judges will introduce favoritism into the justice system and will call into question the objectivity of judges in all matters. When trust in criminal law, the heart of the moral and legal system in every society, is lost, the moral compass and the sense of justice will also be lost," end quote. The letter goes on to say that, quote, "The founders of the state of Israel deliberately limited the power of the government," end quote. But in all sorts of ways, the letter goes on, this government is consolidating seemingly unlimited power over the army, over the schools, over the rabbinate, over the economy, and more. Quote, "Israel can be likened to a ship sailing the high seas. The state's institutions are the keel that stabilizes the ship as it moves across stormy waters, while the politicians hold the rudder and tilt its course left or right. The current government is taking out the keel, consciously dismantling the state's institutions. The results could be even worse than in Poland or Hungary." And the letter ends with this: "As historians who study the history of the Jewish people throughout the ages, we examine the contours of the Israeli state and the state of the Israeli society in their broad historical context. What we see causes grave alarm. Since its establishment, there has never been a graver political crisis in Israel that poses such an immediate danger to the very existence of the state," end quote, which is chilling, of course. Now, we are delighted to have with us the woman who instigated the letter and I think wrote the first draft of the letter and shepherded it to completion. Her name is Professor Orit Rozin, and she's one of our most important historians and a woman whose work I adore. Orit Rozin, I think more than any other historian of Israel, is responsible for a shift from writing about Israel's history as a history of political, military, economic, social, and cultural leaders and their beliefs and official actions to writing history about the rest of us, people trying to build a life, make a living, have and feed a family, make a home, get from here to there, take in a show, and all the rest. For you English speakers, you will want to start with her two wonderful books. First, The Rise of the Individual in 1950s Israel, in which you'll find this passage, quote, "History, like the world we live in, is constructed from just a few foundation stones. It is composed of matter and spirit, of causes and coincidence. Finally, it is built of events and processes. History consists, of course, of great, decisive, and dramatic events, wars, elections, changes of government, and legislative acts. But historical study ought to address not just great dramatic events that shape entire eras, but also the life experiences of people coping with the small, quotidian, and trivial, such as hygiene, nourishment, and consumption. In the end, both the great and the small become a meaningful part of history," end quote. And after you've read that book, you will want to read as well the book, A Home for All Jews, Citizenship, Rights, and National Identity in the New Israeli State, in which you will find this passage, quote, "The test of a new democracy is not merely the extent of the equality that it grants its citizens, but rather the political, socioeconomic, legal, and public infrastructure that it establishes and that allows weak and excluded groups to fight to gain equal rights and freedoms. Whatever its injustices and flaws, Israeli democracy in its early years offered its citizens a worthy dream and tools for making it a reality," end quote. All of which I quote so as to make clear that Professor Orit Rozin brings to Israeli history and to this open letter an important perspective that very few of us have. Still, I'll say now that I'm also a historian of the Jewish people and the state of Israel, though much less accomplished historian, much less good historian than Professor Rozin, and I have got misgivings about this letter. But we will get to that. First, though, tell us, Orit, why did you write the letter, and why did you write the letter in the way that you wrote the letter?
I wrote the letter because I couldn't sleep. And I just felt I had to do something. Mm-hmm. I think all of us who oppose the reform, I would say revolution, upheaval, that Yariv Levin and Simcha Rotman, who are the main characters who promote this change, are planning. I just had to do something. So this is why I wrote it. I wrote it from the bottom of my heart and with a lot of passion. And I think when one reads it, you can see that there's a lot of passion in it. And I think that Zionism is a passion in a way that Professor Penzlar's new book on the history of emotions, on Zionism as an emotion, will show. And first and foremost, we love Israel, even if we hate it, in the sense we're very, very passionate about our state. We're very, very passionate about Israeli society. And we just can't go on with our little lives when things are happening.
Orit, can I ask, and thank you, first of all, thank you for coming, and thank you, Noah, for taking up this, and also to say that this is a matter we've been following with great alarm, what is it again? Alarm, interest, and great concern. Yes. The one thing that I've discovered in my very short academic career is that getting, not to say 10 academics, let alone 160 academics to agree on one thing is mission impossible. Can you tell us a bit about the process of writing this letter and getting such a critical mass of people to agree to sign it in its current form?
Well, there's a very important character that I have to introduce, who is Professor Yuval Rotman, my colleague, who works on as a medievalist. But he was the one who offered to promote it, and he gave it a lot of push. And he's a doer, and he just inspired
were there any
us.
semantic differences, any pitfalls that you found it difficult to agree on, or was it just?
Did you post this as a Google Doc and have people write their comments on it, and was it covered with hashed with 1 million comments?
Actually, no. We had a draft. People saw it. I worked on an early draft with Professor Aryeh Kramf, who is a political. He writes political history of the economy, and with Professor Asaf Lechovsky, who does history of law. And so I needed to get all the facts right. I had worked on facts regarding the.
But the essence of it was
but the essence
consensus.
After we had like a first draft, some colleagues like Professor Scott Uri and others just contributed, and we just changed it. There was no disagreement, really.
Were there any professors that you approached and turned down the offer?
Yes.
Because they didn't want to get involved, or because they had some misgivings about the content?
Okay, so first of all, this is quite a Zionist statement. It doesn't address the occupation. It talks from a very pro-Zionism, I think, passion. So a lot of people who are not Zionists, I didn't even approach them because this wasn't for them. And other people, there were people who were afraid to sign. There were people who felt that it's not broad enough in the sense of it should include all historians, not just historians of the Jewish people. There are all kinds of comments. People who felt uncomfortable with certain statements. It's very hard, academicians are
exactly.
like
they were
cats.
Predictably pesky after
yes,
all.
They're like cats. So they're very individualistic. They're very particular, and we had a lot of help from overseas, from colleagues overseas who pushed it.
Why, by the way, did you decide to include colleagues from overseas? Why is there one group whose identity is we are historians of Jews and of Israel, perhaps in particular, though many of them are historians of periods long before Israel existed. What accounts for that decision to demarcate the group in that way?
It's a feeling. It's a feeling that people engage in writing about the history of the Jews because they care about it. And if they care about it, they will probably care about what happens to the Jews in the future. So that's it. That's the only concern I think that people have professional identities in a way. And they can be very critical of Israel, but they still care deeply. So I think this is it.
Well, I find that to be a beautiful answer, but it does lead me to my next question, which is the misgiving, the major misgiving. I had 2 or 3 misgivings with this letter, but the major one is that a group of professors writing, and in particular, perhaps, professors of the history of Jews and the history of Zionism and the history of Israel, writing as experts together to express this political opinion suggests that this group has some kind of expertise that's important to share. When jurists began to write their letters, and the first letter were professors of law and other jurists, or when legal advisors who have worked in the past in government offices wrote their letters, then they were saying, we have seen this up close. We have information that the rest of you perhaps don't have, insight that the rest of you don't have, and we think that it's crucial that you hear our voices because you have something to learn from us, and that made sense. In the context of professors of Judaism, including, professors of medieval Judaism and professors of Judaism in the United States and professors of Kabbalah and professors of, Jewish natural philosophy in the Renaissance, writing, some of them people who live and work in Israel and some of them people who live and work elsewhere around the world. It feels more as though here are people saying that we have a certain kind of expertise that it's not at all clear that you, or as a historian of Jews and Israel, I'll add myself, that I do not think we really have as a group.
I think we have a kind of expertise that is relevant, and that I professionally write about legal history, so I feel very comfortable with the letter. But I think that other historians who work on Jewish history know what it is to feel to be intimidated by a government, but your own government. And I think that is something we all share. We all share the knowledge of being a minority, what it is like to be a minority, what it is like not to have a state, what it's like to be afraid, what it's like to feel you have no rights. So we all share that. It's not just me who particularly has the knowledge.
You're saying we all know that because we have all researched that, because Jewish history is essentially a long string of that situation recapitulating itself?
No, it isn't. But we all, even if we write about, happy communities somewhere, there's always the sense of being a minority. I mean, especially after, the Second Temple was destroyed. And so it's...
But this is something that also every lay Jew or Zionist or Israeli knows instinctively, right? I mean, what I'm saying is that even the supporters of this judicial overhaul, coup, whatever you want to call it, know that and think that this is the way forward in order to guarantee their safety, both physical and political.
I don't think they think so. I think they're much more cynical than you imagine. And I think they only want is power. That's the only thing they want. They have no other agendas. So I disagree.
What about the people who support them?
But let's just go back and talk about the historians and for Israelis, for Israeli historians, I think, and that applies for the Israeli doctors and the Israeli nurses and the Israeli social workers and so on. We have a debt to the state, because when the state was established, it brought together all the professionals and said, "I'll look after you. You look up. You give me your services." So it's like it was an alliance, and Uri Cohen wrote about it, and I think it was a very important contribution. And because of this alliance, when the state is at stake, and this is what's happening now, because what they are doing is dismantling the state. Because without legal advisors, there is no state. Without the independence of the bureaucracy on the one hand, and their understanding that they have to abide by the law on the other hand, there is no state. So we have this debt. That's one thing. And the other thing is that as intellectuals, it's our duty. It is our duty to say what we say. Otherwise, we betray, whatever we are.
I want to focus on this, the perspective of the historians for a second. Professor Nir Kedar, who's not a signatory of this, I didn't see his name.
No,
he's a legal historian.
Yes, he's a legal historian.
Specializing in the early democratic thought in Zionism, in Israelis. His big research focus was on Ben-Gurion and his Republican thought. He sat here in the studio a few weeks ago. And, of course, we talked about Ben-Gurion and legal history and all that jazz, and we got to the current government's plan for these sweeping changes, and I asked him for his opinion as a historian specializing in it. And he said that, unlike his colleagues, he's more optimistic in the sense that he thinks that the democratic norms in Israel are far more entrenched than other people think. And he's saying it based on his research, that after all, Israel became this, in many ways, exemplary democracy out of nothing and sustained itself over the years, and that's, by the way, he said that this is why Israel is different from Hungary and Poland that don't have that democratic tradition, and therefore all these changes were more easily implemented. But I want to ask you, because you've researched pretty much the same period, although from also a legal history, but from a different perspective. It was like more a grassroots look at the social norms, etc. And even in these years where democracy was not at all a given, Israelis, big and small, managed to carve out this democratic space that later provided for what we see now in terms of the independence of the bureaucracy and administration and all that. Doesn't your research make you more optimistic, seeing what it was like in the 1950s and saying, okay, now in 2023 we're more than that?
I think the Israelis, that we're not the same Israel as we were in the 50s and 60s. Israel now is more religious and more messianic. And I don't think the ultra-Orthodox have such a deep commitment to democracy as they had in the early years, because they felt that they're a small minority and they needed the protection of the state and needed civil rights. They feel like they're becoming more powerful, so they don't need that, and they don't care about other groups. Well, they do and they don't, but they're still careful, but they don't see Klal Israel, they don't see the whole Israel. They have a commitment only to their group. They have a commitment to Jewish tradition, but not to all the Israelis. And I fear that some of the Orthodox do not have this commitment to democracy, and they didn't get the proper education, especially since the occupation, and this is where what we get as a result of more than 50 years of occupation, when we control people who have no rights, and it's fine. We just drive by them and we don't care. And if you start talking about the occupation, everybody falls asleep. So,
well, I certainly agree that there are some on the other side that will tell you that they're not deeply committed to democracy. They see that there's a conflict between democracy and their religious values, and they choose their religious values. But I disagree with you about your characterization of the other side en masse. And that's a matter of fact that it's not worth discussing. But just to get back to first of all, to my problem with, or my misgiving about historians, speaking about historians, and speaking as historians, and we saw this last Friday, then a bunch of scientists from Israel and around the world, Jewish scientists, published a letter that was not at all as sophisticated as yours, but expressed the same, I think, emotion as yours did. And there was a little asterisk near each of the ones that had won a Nobel Prize and each of the ones that had won a Field Prize. And I think that in both cases there is an attempt, I think without meaning to in particular, of translating the social capital that we have as being part of the free liberal professions, and particularly, I think, in academia and in science, into political capital. And the reason why this seems to me to be so important is, for me, I think that one of the most significant events in Israeli history happened on June 27th, 1981, when in Kings of Israel Square, now Kikar Rabin, 100,000 people gathered just days before the election at a Labor Party rally, and the comedian and entertainer Dudu Topaz stood up and said to the crowd, "Look around, look who you see. We are a crowd of generals. We are a crowd of people who are captains of business. We are a crowd of professors. We are a crowd of lawyers, and we are a crowd of judges. And look at them. They did not serve in the army, and if they served at all, they were the gatekeepers. They were the Shomer Shin Gimel, meaning the people that didn't really contribute. And the 100,000 people cheered, and Begin was reelected because most of the country immediately understood that this was the same elitist majority asserting that it had the right, that it was its birthright to rule in this place, and the majority voted to re-elect Menachem Begin, even though polls had him at 7 or 8 points behind before Dudu Topaz spoke. And I think that is that, obviously the undercurrents are much more important than one comedian giving one speech, but I think that is a turning point. And I think that this letter has a little Dudu Topaz-ism in it. I think it's saying, we, the 160 of us who are very degreed and who have as high status as anyone, the people you hear on the radio every morning, the people who write all the articles in the op-ed pages in all the newspapers, we say that this is wrong without any acknowledgement of the other side's narrative, if you will, which I think deserves more acknowledgement than you're giving, including in this interview. And I think that it just reads that way. And I think for the left, if only for strategic reasons, though I think also for very profound, real moral reasons as well, our first commandment at this point has to be, do not be Dudu Topaz, do not be Garbus, do not be these people who we over and over again recapitulate. And we fail at it remarkably all the time. And I feel like obviously, this letter is beautiful, and when you describe your intent, it's beautiful. But I feel like it's inescapable because of to use a fancy university word, because of the agonistic field, because of the field of conflict that this letter enters. I don't see how it can be read in any other way by the people who, I guess you're not trying to convince, but the people on the other side. It's just read like those goddamn elitists are at it again, saying, we're not going to listen to you. You have to listen to us.
Well, I think every reader has his privilege to read something as they please. And I cannot argue with that because you're a reader. And so I won't. On the other hand, I think I'm trying to touch on what brought people to Israel in the first place. And in the first place, they wanted to be free of persecution. I'm not speaking about any elite. I'm speaking about every immigrant to Israel from 1948 onwards. And they wanted to be treated with dignity. And they wanted to feel that the government is not, trying to harm them. And they didn't want to be afraid of what they're going to say or not going to say. And they didn't want to feel, so I think it's everybody. It's not any kind of elite. And when I talk about the feeling that we are not being heard, and this is the main point that I want to make, is that I'm afraid that without any social capital, no one will listen to us. No one is listening in this country because no one has the right to be heard. We have free speech, but no one listens. And what immigrants in the early stages of Israel wanted is they wanted to be heard. And what are we going to do? Otherwise, no one will listen to us. If I just go on the street, we are ignored anyway.
No, but you could write this letter as a citizen and it would have a different valence than if you write it as a historian.
But who would sign it? Who would care about it? Who would interview me if I wrote it as a citizen? No one.
I want to
the
go back
media won't pay any attention
to what Noah said about communicating with the other side, and I think it's futile to try to persuade them, but still acknowledging their claims. And one of their claims is that the people who oppose this judicial reform, coup, whatever you want to call it, is the people who are on the losing side in politics, the defeated left camp, who hold all the positions of power in the administration, in the economy, etc., and they are now being undermined and therefore refuse to accept their defeat. And one of the things in the letter that I thought played into their hands, and I would like to hear your reaction to it, is that it didn't only focus on the judicial reform. You had other points raised, such as, all sorts of other commitments that Netanyahu made to his coalition partners, whether it's splitting powers within the defense ministry, within the education ministry, or decisions that I can see why they are problematic and dangerous for the running of Israel as a proper country run by the rule of law. But still, they are, I think, still within the still legitimate decisions made by the executives about how they want government powers to be distributed. Whereas, I would think that this judicial coup, basically annihilating judicial oversight over government decisions, which is, I think, the crux of the matter here, is on a totally different scale. And I wonder why you didn't just focus on that and chose to bring in other bad things, as it were, that the current Netanyahu government is doing.
I did it because I'm a historian. And I know what it's like beforehand, before when the state was just established. And it was very, very difficult to build a state that is not politicized. And because it was like the transition between the pre-state and the state period is dramatic in the sense that people owed a lot to their parties, but not to the state, because the state did not exist in their mind. It wasn't a being. So what Israel managed to create in the 50s and 60s was a sense that there was something that is called a state, and that is, the Ministry of Inferior Affairs and all that. It wasn't there. So what they're trying to do now is bring us back exactly to 1948. They want to be the state. This is what they're doing when you dismantle the general education by saying we have two different ministers, one in charge of religious education, and one in charge of secular education. You're undoing what was done in 1953. And it's not a minor event. It's a major event. When you are going to give power, I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but you have the plan to give oversight to the minister of the police over certain section of the police. That means that you are undoing the unity of the state, in the sense that only the law enforcement agencies. And I could go on. So it is a major event that no one pays attention to.
I think that's very, very important, and it's true. I know some of what you're referring to by reading your books. There's something deeply, deeply crucial about what you're saying. At the same time, I think that one has to understand the people for whom listening to what you say would say that's not the way that I or my parents or my grandparents experienced the state at all. I mean, I think that if you were to talk, first of all, obviously, if you were to talk to the Palestinians who were under martial law until 1966 and didn't get to vote, they got to vote under certain circumstances, and it was quite limited, and it was jiggered, and a lot of those votes, them, and then the people who protested in Wadi Salib, if you spoke to them, then I'm not sure that they would completely feel that way. And if the folks who got no jobs because they did not join the Histadrut, one of the single most important piece of research that I've ever done in my life was not research at all. It was when I was 10 years ago when I was running for city council in Tel Aviv with Dov Hanin. Then I went around and I spent 3 months knocking on doors, morning till night, 5,000 houses I was in. And the number of people who said to me, there's a woman who still lives around the corner from me, a very much older woman, who I knocked on the door and she said, I will not let any politician in my room, in my house at all. And I talked to her. She realized that I was this strange American person, not threatening. And she told me the story about how her husband came from Europe and spent the rest of his life being humiliated because he was a centrist. He just wasn't a leftist. He was unwilling to join the East Side route, never got a job, never made money. His children were embarrassed about him. That woman, I met 15 of her in Tel Aviv now, in 2010. And I'm sure that for every one that I met, there were 1,000 who had died by then, who didn't live in Tel Aviv, who lived in Yerucham, who had this experience. So for them, and up to the Haredim who are sprayed with boash, with that stinky stuff that the police spray them with, or Avi Noam Frumer, the person who founded Bella Doeget, the AIDS group, who was beaten up by police, but they were certain to put on gloves before they beat him up so that they wouldn't get his blood on their hands because they worried about AIDS. Speak to people and they have stories about this state and they're not happy stories. And so I think that I agree with you. I'm a person who entirely agrees with you, but I think that one has to understand that the rage that people feel and the distrust for the state and their overwhelming desire to dismantle these things, to burn it down, which you're right is terrible and dangerous. It comes from a place of experience, of seeing your parents humiliated time and time and time and time again. And I think that we need to recognize that and not just say, ugh, them.
I agree.
But it doesn't really come across in the letter.
Oh, you can't cover everything. You have to focus on something. It's not a book. And I think in my book you see that I'm very critical of the state, and that you'll see that in my next book.
Absolutely.
You'll see that in my next book as well. I'm not saying the state was perfect, far from it, or I'm not saying that Mapai was perfect, far from it. I'm just saying that there was space to express yourself, and there was space to demand your rights and to be heard sometimes.
But much more if you were one sort of person than if you were another sort of person.
No, I don't. This is something I disagree with. Because if I have a beautiful example of immigrants from Iraq who organized in the Ma'abara, the transition camp, and wrote a petition and have everyone in the Ma'abara sign it. And they went into the Knesset, into the parliament, and they just barged in and they said, we want to be heard. And they were sat down and one member of Knesset spoke to them. They were not friendly, but they did feel they had the obligation to hear them out. And I think this is a major thing when you look at what's happening now at the Legislation and Law and Legislation Committee. And with Rothman, he doesn't care. You can see that people speak and he's just there in the room because he needs to be there. This is a difference. And
he's one of the sponsors of this so-called judicial reform.
Yes, and in the 50s, the writers organized to go and listen to immigrants in the Ma'abara. And there were volunteers and women and all kinds of volunteers just went, and they couldn't do a lot. They tried to do whatever they could, but they were there to listen. And a lot of people felt that no one's listening to them, although they were there and they were listening. But at least they tried. I don't think anyone tries to listen. And I do understand the rage. I understand it very well. And in many times, they're right to be angry. But if they burn down the state, what they get is a king. And we don't want that. We don't want the king to decide about everything, because then we don't have any rights.
You and I agree about how terrible the burning down is. The only thing that we disagree about is how important it is to have kind of a theory of politics of the other side that tries to understand why, that doesn't make it seem like a naked power grab, but makes it seem like the result of 75 years of bitter experience.
I think what Orit is trying to say, I'm sorry, you can elaborate on it, is that it's just, cynical politicians building on this very legitimate rage, right? It's a confluence of several factors.
Absolutely, because if you see the people behind the scenes, they are neoliberals who only care about making money, and I don't think they have one thought about the rights of the masses or their well-being. Not at all. They're worried about their own power, and they're worried about making the others pay for being there or doing stuff they didn't like, and that's it.
Okay, I'm absolutely delighted that we got to discuss this on this first and maybe not last joint Tel Aviv Review Promise podcast. Thank you very much, Orit Rozin.
Thank you, Orit,
for actually allowing us to do this and allowing me and Noah to sit in the same room.
Lovely, beautiful thing to be so open-hearted about and be so willing to discuss this.
Yes, thank you very much, and good luck to all of us with saving the country. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Orit.
Bye.
Bye.